Hey friends, welcome to episode 496 of the My 123 Cents podcast. We are 4 weeks away from episode 500, and honestly, as much as I'd love to have something big and grandiose to celebrate or plan or talk about at this point, I don't. And you know, this past 2 or 3 weeks has just literally and figuratively kicked my ass. I am like coasting through on fumes for this, and I apologize for that, and I hope my little rant here at the beginning, or rant isn't probably the right word, but my synopsis, because I had every intention this past week of recording something early in the week, having it in the can and ready to go, because my daughter I knew was graduating from high school on Saturday night, and then Sunday all day. We were going to have a house full of people, out of town guests included, in celebrating the graduation with a graduation party. Um, and I tried, because the previous week kicked my ass at work, and then I thought, oh well, I'll get caught up next week, and then next week came and is almost over, and I found myself just kind of not in a mindset, not in a mood, and I for the first time, I think since this podcast started almost 10 years ago, the first time I thought about what difference does it make if a show doesn't drop on Monday morning? Well, in my head, I got to make it happen. So here I am putting this show together. And I had debated, I wasn't sure what I was going to do because I knew scheduling a guest was not going to be possible because I waited too long through the week to really do something with an outside guest. And then, I'm recording this Sunday evening. It's early in the evening still, but nonetheless, it is the evening. It is after the graduation party. I am wearing pink. The theme was pink. So I wore pink to the party. If you are watching on YouTube, you realize what I'm talking about here. But I kind of struggled with what to do because I still, Vinnie Barry, owe him a shot, or not a shot, but a spot rather here on the podcast to talk about the Black Bart book, and that is going to happen sooner rather than later. Chad and I have a couple of ideas to do some shows, a movie mania, some music mania podcast, perhaps. Um, so Chad is going to be here again soon as well. But in the meantime, and I debated and I thought, one thing I thought I do have a couple of new beers, and I thought maybe a Wrestling Under the Influence. But honestly, this past week was also National Craft Beer Week, or American Craft Beer Week. And I drank and did a review on my friends recently went to Michigan and brought back all kinds of beer. I actually have a few left over still that I'll do reviews on at some other time. You can check those out on my personal Facebook or over on TikTok. I am at Kevin underscore Huntsberger there as well as on Instagram. But anyway, I didn't feel like drinking another beer and doing a review on the podcast. So I may save the one that I've got for down the road and do something with that. But as I pause to rehydrate, because like I said, it was a graduation party earlier, and yeah. Um, I was sitting in the graduation ceremony on Saturday night, and this is our third kid, and so we've had three kids graduate high school. Two of them have graduated college, so our daughter will attend college in the fall, and so kind of sitting and reflecting and thinking about what to do for a podcast. And it's kind of weird how these things work. As if you are a wrestling fan and listening to this, you probably 99.9% chance that you are a wrestling fan. I think our minds and our brains and memories and thought processes work differently than, say, the average bear. And so I came up with the idea of looking back on May of 1991, which is the year that I graduated, the month that I graduated, comparing that landscape, that scene of wrestling, to present day, May of 2024. And if you're listening to this later, then obviously this is different. But in this time capsule, we're going to look at May 1991 versus May 2024. And by May 1991, I had been probably a fan of wrestling for probably about 8 or 9 years, like a diehard fan for about 8 years. And so I seen some live house shows. I had been a fan of everything, and this is where I think some of the differences in wrestling really kind of shine through compared to today. You know, back then in '91, I was watching, you know, even leading up to '91, because I think some of these companies had dissolved or weren't around so much anymore. But I was watching WWF, WWE, WCW. I think it had just changed and changed names. The AWA was, I think, maybe hanging on by a thread. Maybe it was gone by '91. But I do remember coming home from school and watching. And by May of '91, I'm graduated. So, but I remember in high school coming home and watching AWA, and for a little bit there, watching even World Class on ESPN. They were playing the show in the afternoons. Um, you know, Herb Abrams, UWF, which, as I'm saying that, I remember now, I did not go back and look up many details about that. I never watched Herb Abrams UWF. It was all through the aftermags that I heard and saw what was going on there. And I kind of in hindsight wish I would have seen some of that, because there were a lot of former WWF, WWE talent going through there at the time. And I know there was lots of controversy, the Dark Side of the Ring episode and all that good stuff. But um, really by '91, primarily we're down to, at least what I was watching, was able to and had access to in the St. Louis area, was the WWF and WCW. And I know that some of these other companies were still around, or, you know, USWA was still trying to make a thing of it, and but the TV was not there anymore. I don't remember watching any of the newly renovated USWA on TV. And so today's wrestling, obviously, with the internet, with YouTube, with streaming services, you know, we can have access to just about anything we want. There's no tape trading. There's no waiting for a tape to arrive. We're watching it when we want, and in real time in most cases. But the other thing was, like I said, I just listed a litany of companies from, you know, the earlier times of the AWA and World Class, UWF, uh, uh, USWA, Central States. I watched them all. You know, Mid South and UWF eventually became the same thing. But I was watching the stuff on TBS. I was watching stuff on USA. I was watching stuff on KPLR and on KDNL in St. Louis. I'm watching all of those and enjoying all of those. And now, and I, you know, I would admit that I do uh, complain, usually though, just via social media messaging to Chad and Tyler and a few of my other friends. I'll make comments about things, not just AEW, but mostly making fun of AEW or questioning things. And yeah, believe me, nobody's perfect. No, except for one person on this list that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But um, so yeah, it is what it is, and I think that if it'd be nice to get back to that time of the '80s and of the '90s where we watched what we wanted to watch, and you know, it didn't cause you know, meltdowns and people calling each other names and making fun of each other and ridiculing each other on social media. Of course, in the '90s we didn't have social media, but you know what I'm saying. So anyway, let's rewind to May 1991. Ric Flair, of course, is the WCW World Heavyweight Champion, the big gold belt, but it's actually not going to be much longer that he's there and that he jumps ship and heads to the WWF. And I remember that being a very significant moment, probably one of my biggest, most memorable, favorite moments of my fandom, because again, this is before uh, the internet, and so nobody spoiled it, nobody ruined it. Right before I left to go to college, I was watching Wrestling Challenge, and Bobby Heenan comes out at the end holding the big gold belt with Gorilla Monsoon and Jim Neidhart, and I was stunned. Now, in July of that year, I had seen the little ticker on WCW Saturday Night saying that Ric Flair was not going to be defending the title at the Great American Bash, but I had no idea that meant he was going to the WWF. So I was super stoked when he finally did come over. But we are talking about May don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. So, some 33 years ago, Ric Flair was your WCW heavyweight champion. Lex Luger, of course, was the United States champion. He eventually went on to win the heavyweight title after Flair left. The tag team champions, the duo of Rick and Scott Steiner, one of the all-time great tag teams to say the very least, and the TV champion in WCW at that time, beautiful Bobby Eaton. And he actually won the belt. I'm recording the show on Sunday, May 19th, 2024, and Bobby Eaton won that title on I don't know if it was a Sunday or not, but he won that title on May 19th, 1991, beating Arn Anderson. So a long time champion there, TV champion. Bobby wouldn't hold it very long before losing it to stunning Steve Austin, and we know how that story ends. But the roster in WCW pretty robust. You know, like I mentioned, you had Stone Cold Steve or stunning Steve Austin there at the time. Brian Pillman's there, Sting is there, Vader is there. You know, a lot of the staples that achieved much greatness in WCW. The Diamond Stud is still there, who is Scott Hall. Oz, not sure if Oz was there at that point or if this was still the Vinny Vegas run, but eventually we see Oz, and who eventually morphs into Kevin Nash, who goes over to the other side as well. I think Oz came later this year. I remember seeing Oz's debut. I think I was already in college when Oz came out on that Clash of the Champions. Over on the other channel, the WWF, Hulk Hogan. By the way, Sting had been WCW champion until the first part of January of 1991, and that's when Ric Flair wins the belt back. It's a very similar trajectory. We talked earlier, a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, maybe now at this point, as how 1990 and 91 are kind of parallel in wrestling with WCW and the WWF. You know, you had Ultimate Warrior and Sting, the neon makeup, the neon tights, the crazy hair, the wacky promos, the big muscular builds, and how they both rose to prominence in their respective companies. And Warrior a little bit quicker than Sting, and I think only because Sting got hurt. I think he was slated to win the WCW championship in February of 1990, but was delayed until July. And Warrior, of course, wins the WWF WWE championship at WrestleMania 6 in 1990, April of 1990. But fast forward a year, both men are no longer with their belts. Warrior loses the belt in January at the Royal Rumble to Sergeant Slaughter, who then goes on to drop it to Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 7. And like I said, Sting was the WCW champion. He loses it also in January of 91 to Ric Flair. So by May of 91, both of the former staples of their respective companies are back on top of the mountain. And by this point, I think fans were growing weary of both men being on top of the mountain. Mr. Perfect is your Intercontinental Champion, and back then, WWF only had 3 championships. The Nasty Boys are your World Wrestling Federation Tag Team Champions, beating the Hart Foundation at WrestleMania 7. They would lose those belts later that summer to the Road Warriors or the Legion of Doom at SummerSlam. But, you know, speaking of the rosters, like I said a minute ago for WCW, WWF has The Undertaker and the Mountie and Hulk Hogan. I'm sorry, and the Ultimate Warrior is still there for a little bit. Colonel Mustafa, Sergeant Slaughter, Hacksaw Duggan, Jake the Snake, Brick Martel. You know, your staple. A lot of the same guys from the late 80s are still there and hanging on and getting repackaged in some cases, but in some cases also it's growing a little stale. And I think there was a big group of us that were growing up with it, and now we're graduating, we're moving on. And maybe part of that led to some of the changes that we saw eventually. You know, things kind of stagnated in 92, 93. And then we see more of the occupational gimmicks coming through and some of that silliness. But I was still watching religiously, and I was still buying the magazines monthly, getting my subscriptions monthly, and picking up some at the newsstand as well before heading off to college, where I continue to still purchase those wrestling magazines that are sitting in my garage right now, just kind of collecting dust. But I wanted to kind of compare and contrast, like I said, And since WCW is no longer around, I am going to use AEW as kind of the example to butt up against WCW, because I think there were some parallels with the championships, of course, as far as the number of championships and titles. Swerve Strickland currently is your AEW heavyweight champion. Adam Copeland, the artist formerly known as Edge, is the TNT champion, so kind of their equivalent, I would say, of the TV title. I wasn't sure if the international championship or the continental championship would be comparable to the U.S. title in this case. But Roderick Strong is your international champion, and Okada is your continental champion. And then the tag team champions are the Young Bucks. So comparing that to WCW, Ric Flair and Swerve Strickland are at the top of the heap, the top of the mountain in their respective companies. And, probably living very nostalgically and going back in time, I got to go with, for the most part, I would say Flair over Swerve Strickland. If these guys wrestled in their heydays, which obviously 91, maybe even a little earlier for Flair, but I'd give Flair the edge against Swerve Strickland right now. Adam Copeland versus beautiful Bobby Eaton. I love Bobby Eaton, former guest here on the podcast, but Edge, Adam Copeland. I think even in his in his early 50s, I think he's got some stuff to prove and some things to do. So I would give Adam Copeland the edge on that one. Now, whether or not we're talking about Roderick Strong or Okada to face off against Lex Luger, or maybe we put him in a triple threat match, I think I'd give the edge to Okada there. But I do think Lex Luger versus Roderick Strong, it would be Lex Luger is who I would pick. And then the Steiners against the Young Bucks. I sorry to those fans of modern day current wrestling, but I'm going Rick and Scott Steiner all the way. I think they are one of the greatest tag teams of all time. The Young Bucks, and again, I don't watch enough of AEW to put them on the pedestal that many have. I'm sure that they have accomplished a lot and are great as a tag team. But, for me, I'm going with that era of the Steiners and the Road Warriors and Demolition, the British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation. Those were my tag teams. And that's, again, not a knock against the Young Bucks. I'm sure they would hold their own and put on a great performance, but I think the Steiners would destroy them. And I believe me, I know it's all in the name of wrestling. So I'm not saying this is legitimate fighting by any means when I say this. WWE these days, you've got Cody Rhodes as the Universal Champion, and of course they've added Damian Priest as the WWE Champion after they decided to add a second heavyweight championship. Facing off against Hulk Hogan back then. I mean, Hulk Hogan was the man. And I'm not saying, again, who I like more or what, but I do think Hulk Hogan would reign supreme. Now, maybe if you turn Cody heel and gave him a manager and someone to work with, that would make for an interesting match against Hulk Hogan. But Cody and Hogan right now, Cody's kind of that face of the company. Hulk Hogan was always the face of the company back in the 80s and early 90s. So I see the parallels there. And I do think, as far as a hype man goes, I mean, Hogan had charisma that is off the charts. And I don't think Cody Rhodes has that, but I do think Cody Rhodes has that demeanor to go out and be on a talk show and be taken seriously. Not that I necessarily think wrestlers have to be taken seriously, but I think it helps when they're in there communicating and articulating and talking with hosts and not over the top and Cody's always dressed to the nines, whereas Hogan would go on a show and be in his spandex and a cut up t-shirt and a bandana. So from the PR perspective, I would give it to Cody Rhodes. But from the wrestling, if they were to have a match, just because of the popularity of Hulk Hogan, and again, I'm looking at both of these guys in their primes. Sami Zayn is the Intercontinental Champion right now. Mr. Perfect was the Intercontinental Champion in 1981. I think of all the tag team possibilities or of all the matches between then and now possibilities, I think this is the hardest one for me to pick because I do think both men are extremely talented. Um, I would give a very, very slight edge, though, I think, to Sami Zayn. Um, Now, if Bobby Heenan is around, and this was the time when Heenan was kind of retiring from managing and doing more on commentary, I don't know if Coach had come in yet. The coach had come in yet to take over for Mr. Perfect. We're getting close though, and so I don't know how much longer Heenan is managing, but it'd be an interesting matchup to say the very least. Now you got Logan Paul as the United States champion, and really because I threw the U.S. title match under the AEW banner. But if you made it a three-way with Logan Paul, Bobby Eaton, I'm sorry, Logan Paul, Mr. Perfect, and Cody or Sami Zayn, wow, that would be very interesting. I like Logan Paul. I know he gets a lot of shit for being a celebrity and doesn't defend the title, and he's taking someone's spot. And my argument is if he's only wrestling 2 or 3 times a year or only on a handful of PLEs, is he really taking a spot? He's not taking the spot during the lead up to the matches, and he's in there in a match against someone, and he's always making, the matches are always better because he has been a part of them, in my opinion. So I think Logan Paul is great, and yeah, I think he's outside of the ring rather douchey, but I mean, it is what it is. The guy brings eyeballs and attention wherever he goes. So I am a Logan Paul fan, as a performer in the ring, getting in there and wrestling. Tag team titles again have been split. The Nasty Boys taking on either Miz and R-Truth, or Austin Theory and Grayson Waller, or we make it a triple threat. Listen, I said it last week. Nasty Boys were never my jam. I just never resonated with me. Never a huge fan of them. Didn't hate them, but never liked. Yeah, they were never on my top 10 list in any case, any way, shape, or form. I do like the pairing of Austin Theory and Grayson Waller. It's a young team. I think that they still have a lot of potential. And again, another team I think that gets some grief, or performers that get grief because they are green. We as fans want new, we want different, we want something else. And then when we get new and different and something else, we immediately bitch about it. And so I think we need to be better at that as well. R-Truth and Miz, though, I love those guys. Although I like the Miz better as a heel, but R-Truth these days can do no wrong. So it would be an interesting matchup to say the very least. But I would give it to one of the more modern day teams of either uh, Theory and Waller, or Awesome Truth, to say the very least. And again, not to disparage or besmirch the history of the Nasty Boys, a great duo in their own right. The other big difference that I've noticed between now and 1991 in a positive way is women's wrestling. It has become more prolific. It has become a bigger part of the business, especially in WWE. And I'm only using WWE as the example because back in 91, AEW didn't exist. So in 1991, I don't think there was even a women's champion listed. If there was any women's wrestling at that time, it was spot shows, and there was nothing focused. Talent-wise, Elizabeth was making her way back as a manager for Randy Savage. Sensational Sherry, the Queen, had just fired the Macho King, Randy Savage. So Savage was actually kind of in no man's land. He wasn't wrestling yet. It wasn't really until we got closer to SummerSlam that we see him becoming more active, with Elizabeth, that is. But Sherry, starts managing the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, and being more hands-on in that role. WCW didn't really have a whole lot of women. I think Missy Hyatt was here at this point, and in interview capacity. I don't know if she was managing anyone at that point, but times they were a changing, and they eventually changed for the better, and the women were serving as more than just eye candy. And fast forward 33 years later, and the women are, in some cases having bigger, better matches, and showcasing that talent in ways that sometimes the guys just don't do. So I do think that women's wrestling has come a long way, and I'm here for it. I enjoy it. I think it's great. Um, so in that regard, there's been a big change in the way that we watched and saw things going on uh, back in that time period. The other thing, I noticed, and again, I'm not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill or make issues out of something that don't necessarily need to be made issues of, but the minority factor. You look at the champions that I listed in 1991. There's not one minority. We've got Ric Flair, the Steiner brothers, Lex Luger, beautiful Bobby Eaton, Hulk Hogan, Mr. Perfect, and the Nasty Boys. What is that? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Caucasian men. And again, nothing wrong with that. But you fast forward to today, Swerve Strickland, Adam Copeland, Roderick Strong, Okada, the Young Bucks, Cody, Damian Priest, Sami Zayn, The Miz, R-Truth, Logan Paul, Austin Theory, Grayson Waller. So, we've got diversity in our champions. We've got diversity in both companies. International stars coming in, indie stars coming in. So it's better for the business. The business is better. The talent rosters are deeper. The talent rosters, in my opinion, are better. Now, the nostalgia will always win for me, but I think that when you've got guys that are in there and their talent and what they're doing is amazing and phenomenal. Some have argued that AEW's got the best roster that they've had ever. WWE's roster is very solid. It'll be good to see once everyone who's on the DL or who has kind of left and taken some time off. I'm curious what things look like after SummerSlam and after Wembley for AEW. But I hope that the companies thrive, the companies grow and develop, because I do think that wishing ill will or wanting one company to go away or not to be as strong as the other or strong as they can be, it hurts the business. And as fans, we should do everything we can to support and help and grow and nurture and develop. And that doesn't just go for the two I named. And yeah, I just focus on AEW and WWE, but TNA and Ring of Honor and MLW and New Japan. There are so many great, talented companies out there and so many talents that are trying to put their foot in the door, make their way to the top, be a part of the bigger wrestling scene. And I think we as fans should support, encourage, push, and hope that these companies thrive, survive, and continue on. And we have more options to watch, whether it's via streaming, whether it's via social media, whether it's via sitting down in front of our TVs and watching and investing some time in those. So again, if you're rooting for a company to go out of business, shame on you. We should all be better and in hoping that companies grow, survive, and move on. So that's it for this week's episode. If you are, or if you have someone in the class of 2024, congratulations. Good luck to you. I wish you all the very best. We're going to sign off for now, but be sure again to check out other videos on the My 123 Cents channel and other podcasts at jitterymonkey.com. That is where the archives are held. And be sure to check out, leave a review, and let me know what is your 123 cents on my 123 cents. Friends, have a great week, and we will talk again soon.